Good afternoon, everybody. This is Pastor Ty coming at you for a sermon recap. Today, we're going to go back over the sermon that I gave this past Sunday, which would have been November the 23rd. And it covered the first 15 verses of Mark 15. And I just want to take a few moments here on this lovely Tuesday afternoon to just go over some of the main points that we covered on Sunday, and even more than that, I want to go over a couple of things that didn't make their way into the sermon that I think are important additions to the main content we spoke of on Sunday. So the title of the sermon for Mark 15, 1 through 15 was The Silent King. And there's a few reasons why it was titled that way. Number one, because in Mark 15, you see the gospel writer Mark begin to reference Christ as king repeatedly. So in the first 15 verses of Mark 15, Jesus is referenced as king 3 different occasions. And then next week, when we cover verses 16 through 32 in Mark 15, again 3 times Jesus is going to be referenced as king. And so one of the reasons why we titled the sermon The Silent King is because from here on out, Jesus' reference to being a kingly figure grows exponentially in the text. The other thing I want us to note, though, is that the first half of the sermon title was The Silent King. And the reason why is because Jesus has very little to say in this passage, and that's certainly on purpose. So before we get into why Jesus had so little to say, I first want to sort of bring up the difference in how Sunday's sermon went in comparison to how some of the other sermons we've given in this sermon series have gone. Throughout the sermon series, as the text has sort of just laid itself out to me, I've ended up categorizing different sections of the text. So if I've got 12 verses, then like verses 1 through 3 will be sectioned as one heading, and then sections 4 through 8 will be sectioned as a heading, and sections 9 through 12 and corresponding. But on this occasion, I actually mixed it up, and instead of referencing different sections of verses, what we did on Sunday was we referenced different figures in the text. And so it wasn't per se like verses 1 through 3, it was Pilate. It wasn't verses 4 through 8, it was the Sanhedrin. And so I want to take just a few moments and recognize how each person or group was referenced in the text on the Sunday sermon. So for instance, we started with Pilate. And the point around Pilate was quite simple. It's that, and literally everything Pilate did in this section of Mark was what you'd expect from a career politician. Pilate is constantly hedging his bets. He's constantly looking for the expedient, most popular thing he can do that will make his job the easiest. And one of the main reasons why it's important to recognize this was because Pilate was governor of the province of Judea. And so his job is to keep tranquil a fringe portion of the Roman Empire. So he was established as governor by the emperor, and his job was to keep that section of the Roman Empire tranquil. That was his job. And so in as much as his job detailed, his motivation was to Caesar, and his motivation was to keep things calm. And so what do you see throughout the text? What do I got to do to keep this restless group chilled? And that's what he did. Even as you start to realize that Pilate understands Jesus means no threat to Rome, what he realizes is that in potentially releasing Jesus, there will emerge another threat to Rome. So we're going to get into that here in a minute. So that's Pilate, the career politician who acts just like a politician. The second group, or the first group I want to talk about, is sort of one more analysis of the Sanhedrin. The group of Jewish leaders who bring Jesus to Pilate. And there's a couple things that we broke down in the text on Sunday. The first one is that now all of a sudden, why the Sanhedrin decided to meet illegally, unsanctioned, in the middle of the night makes a lot of sense, because Pilate and all Roman magistrates, they took their meetings at sunrise. They took their meetings at daybreak. They started at the beginning of the morning. And so if the Sanhedrin wanted to successfully bring Christ to Pilate with charges, then they already needed to know what those charges were. They already had to have their ducks in a row. And so the only way that they can be prepared to meet Pilate at daybreak is if they meted prior to, in order to figure out what's what. And so that explains why they met in the middle of the night. The other thing I want to make sure everybody catches that we discussed on Sunday was this realization that the charges that the Sanhedrin used to condemn Jesus in their own circle are not the charges they bring to Pilate, and that's on purpose. So notice this. At the end of Mark 14, the charges against Jesus that caused the high priest to rend his garments and to rhetorically ask, what more do we need to hear, was that Jesus was guilty of blasphemy. He had blasphemed Yahweh, the God of Israel. But notice that when they come to Pilate, they don't label Jesus a blasphemer. They charge Jesus with high treason. And so notice that they take a spiritual issue, a theological issue, and when they come to the Roman prefect, now it's a political issue. So they bring to Pilate Jesus, the political agitator, not Jesus, the blasphemer. And if you're wondering why they did that, it's because Rome could care less if Jesus was claiming to be God. But Rome is going to care if they think they have a political agitator on their hands. If they think they have someone who is trying to rip away part of the Roman Empire in a thrust of independence, that would be a sensitivity. And so when Pilate asked Jesus, so you're the king of the Jews? He is in effect asking, is your aim a political uprising? Is your aim to take back Israel from Roman jurisdiction and make it a free state again? That is in effect what Pilate is skeptically asking. He's like, so you're king of the Jews, huh? And of course, Jesus' own answer speaks to the complexity of this situation. So let's get to Jesus, the silent king. The only thing Jesus says in the entire passage we covered on Sunday is, you have said it yourself, or you have said so. And so there's a lot baked into that phrase, right? In effect, what Jesus is saying when he says, you've said so, is, I'm a king, but you and I both know I'm not the kind of king they're saying I am. And so the point I had on Sunday as it pertains to Jesus is, the reason we know Jesus wasn't a political agitator is because Jesus does the one thing no politician can do, and it's be quiet. Like Jesus was silent. His silence speaks to the fact he's not a politician. He's not a political agitator. And the way I framed this up on Sunday was, a politician can't be quiet if their poll numbers don't look the way they want them to. Do you think a politician would be quiet if they were facing the death penalty? If they were facing ultimate destruction? There's no way a politician would be quiet, but Jesus is quiet because he's not just a politician. He's the king of the universe. He's the silent king. He knows he has authority over Pilate. He knows he has authority over the Sanhedrin. He knows he has authority over Caesar. But Jesus, in exercising his authority, stays quiet because he's in control of everything that's happening in this text today. Now, the two other things I want us to make note of are Barabbas and the mob. And so we'll start with Barabbas. One of the things we talked about with Barabbas is his figure is so important because we're told he was in Roman imprisonment because he had taken part in a bloody insurrection that he had killed in the name of Jewish freedom, and was retaliating against Roman occupation. So I want us to make note of something here. Jesus is being brought forth to Pilate for the very thing Barabbas is. Jesus, had he been like Barabbas, would have never been brought forth to Pilate by the Sanhedrin. So I want us to catch this. This is one of the main points I had on Sunday. The Sanhedrin are charging Jesus with the thing they wish he was. Jesus is not a political agitator. He is not a revolutionary. He is not out to establish Jewish independence. He's out to liberate souls. And so notice that the charge that the Sanhedrin bring to Pilate about Jesus is actually what they secretly wish he was. Because when Pilate has the king of the Jews and Barabbas before the crowd and says, which one do you want? Who do they pick? They pick the man with the bloody dagger. They pick the revolutionary. And so what we're seeing in the text is that the thing that Jesus is guilty of is the very thing he isn't. And that's why he's being brought forth by the Sanhedrin to Pilate. But the other thing I want us to catch about Barabbas is something fascinating. His name literally means son of the Father. And so I want us to catch what's happening in the text on Sunday. God's capital S Son traded places with God's Son. Isn't that a beautiful play on words? Like the lowercase s, God's Son, is replaced on the cross by God's capital S Son. So there's this beautiful word play. There's this beautiful interchange occurring between the guilty one, who is a capital or a lowercase s Son of God, who is being taken away from his guilty verdict, and the innocent, blameless, capital S God's Son is taking his place. That is at the core, the epicenter of the gospel. That is the nerve center of the good news. This replacement of the guilty off the cross with the innocent one being put on it. And so we all have to see Barabbas in ourselves. And then the last thing I want us to recognize is the mob. This fickle, restless crowd that is chanting, "Crucify him." And just recognizing that so many of those people in that crowd probably didn't wake up that morning knowing that in a few hours they're going to be chanting, "Crucify him," to Pilate. But that's how groupthink works. And so I want us to notice two things as we close today. Number one, I want us to notice this restless crowd and recognize that the more we pay attention to the world around us, isn't our world a restless crowd? Aren't we, as a collective of humans, restless? Aren't we looking for that capital P, peace, that shalom, that deep-seated satisfaction? We're all looking for that. And Christians are the only ones who have begun the process of taking hold of that. And then the last thing I want us to recognize is that Pilate is just like the religious leaders. So many times in Mark's gospel, Jesus effectively shuts up the religious leaders because they fear the crowds. What are we told Pilate did this morning in the text? We're told that he wishes to satisfy the crowd. So even though he knows Jesus isn't guilty of anything, he hands Jesus over to be crucified because he wants to satisfy the crowd. So Pilate, the Sanhedrin, they're all the same. Their goal is to satisfy the crowds. Their goal is to operate in such a way as that they're operating from a position of fear towards the people because they're politicians, they're officials. But Jesus stands apart. Jesus doesn't operate that way because he is the king. And in this text, this morning on Sunday, he was the silent king. But what I want us to recognize is that Jesus doesn't remain silent. In fact, because he rose from the grave, Jesus, we're told now in Romans chapter, I want to say it's Romans 10. I'll have my notes in front of me. But I believe it's Romans 10. We're told that Jesus intercedes at the right hand of the Father. So Jesus today, for the Christian, isn't silent. His sanctifying work for us isn't a silent affair. His salvation work for us was. But today, Jesus has something to say. He is constantly interceding at the right hand of the Father on behalf of us. Isn't that good news? So anyway, that's all for today. We will have a sermon preview probably on Friday because we all have something to do on Thursday. But on Friday, I'll come back with a sermon preview and we'll cover what will be preparation for the sermon on this upcoming Sunday on Mark 15, 16 through 32. Until then, God bless. Have a happy Thanksgiving, and we'll all talk real soon. Bye.